happen in a few hours actually takes place, and we get all of the details of everything that actually really went wrong with this mission and the consequences of those failures. And there's probably going to be some significant questions asked as to whether or not the private sector can really handle Artemis missions of this importance. Is it really possible to explore the moon on the cheap? Well, we're going to find out on this special bulletin of the Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to the Angry Astronaut. I'd like to apologize for not appearing on cameras much lately. I've been down with the flu. I actually have a tremendous amount of pain in my mouth at the moment. It's a little difficult even to talk, so if I'm not up to my usual standards, I apologize, but this stuff needs to be reported on because there are some significant things that have happened with this mission that we really need to take into consideration, and NASA needs to make some hard decisions here in the near future as to how they want to proceed with future Artemis missions. As most of us probably know, Intuitive Machines discovered that the laser rangefinders on Odysseus were inoperable a couple of hours before they were due to land on the moon last Thursday. However, what a lot of people haven't reported is the fact that they failed to install a pencil-sized pin and a wire harness that enabled the laser to be turned on and off, an unfortunate oversight that really had some very significant consequences. As a result, the company really had to scramble to rewrite its software to take advantage of 3 telescopes on a NASA payload and the navigation Doppler LiDAR for precise velocity and range sensing for altimetry purposes. While this software patch mostly worked, Steve Altemus revealed yesterday that the flight computer on board Odysseus was unable to process data from the NASA payload in real time. Therefore, the last accurate altitude reading the lander received came when it was 15 kilometers above the lunar surface and more than 12 minutes from touchdown. And that meant, of course, that the probe had no idea what altitude it was at for the last 12 minutes of descent. Now, under these circumstances, the probe absolutely should have crashed. However, the team found some innovative ways of keeping it going. By comparing imagery data frame by frame, the flight computer could determine how fast it was moving relative to the lunar surface, and then knowing its initial velocity and altitude prior to initiating powered descent, and then using data from the Inertial Measurement Unit, or IMU, on board Odysseus, they could get a rough idea of altitude. Like I say, a very innovative use of data, but it only went so far. And as they neared the lunar surface, the lander believed that it was about 100 meters higher relative to the moon than it actually was. So instead of touching down with a vertical velocity of just 1 meter per second and no lateral movement, Odysseus was coming down 3 times faster and with a lateral speed of 2 meters per second. So the lateral movement was not to avoid some sort of obstacle, it was simply because the probe thought it was higher than it actually was. According to Altemus, quote, that little geometry made us hit a little harder than we wanted to. Now, a little harder, I think, is a bit of an understatement, and it's very fortunate that the probe was not absolutely destroyed. But all was not lost. Again, it is impressive how much they were able to accomplish given how little they had to work with. Based on the data downloaded from the spacecraft and imagery from NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which flew over the landing site, Intuitive Machines has determined that the lander came down to the surface and likely skidded. The force caused one of its 6 landing legs to snap, and then for a couple of seconds, the lander stood upright before toppling over due to its failed leg. So it didn't really trip, it just broke its leg because it wasn't designed to hit like that. Later today, we are apparently going to see an incredible photo of this moment where the lander was upright and the snap leg and the engine still firing apparently before it actually toppled over. Pretty amazing that they got that shot, but unfortunately, a good shot doesn't mean that the mission is going to be completed successfully. And the consequences of this crash landing and the vehicle's subsequent orientation on the lunar surface was pretty significant. Not necessarily cataclysmic, but significant. Over the weekend, the company scientists and engineers raced to understand what had happened to the lander and what its actual condition was. Yeah, it was on its side, but that side was elevated, and that's because Odysseus had fallen over on a 12% grade. That helped out a little bit as far as the solar panels were concerned. However, the top of the lander was now lying on the ground, and there was a large solar panel there that was supposed to be gathering energy. And this was not pointed towards the part of the horizon where the sun was. Pretty much the same as the SLIM lander situation from JAXA. However, the orientation of SLIM's solar panels seemed to have been a bit better than what Odysseus's were, at least as far as the operation of the probe is concerned, because all the power coming into Odysseus was coming from a single solar panel on its side, which was now facing upward, and that was producing about 170 watts of power. That's enough to operate the lander, but not enough to simultaneously use a powerful quasonics transmitter that sends broadband data back to the satellite dishes on Earth. This requires 210 watts of power. So Intuitive Machines had to make a choice as to whether or not to just keep operating Odysseus for several more days on lower power as the sun sank back towards the horizon, or to use that power when they had good line-of-sight communications with the large satellite dishes back on Earth, including the Goonhilly Earth Station here in the UK. And so Steve Altemus and his team went with the latter option. Quote, the question is, do you want to limp along and stay alive with everything shut off, or do you want to go on to quasonics when you have the big ear listening and get all the data you can? And that's the decision we made, to go get all the data. It's not how long you stay alive, it's how much information you glean from the mission. The engineers were able to answer another mystery as well. They were getting communication from all 4 antennas on the lander, but 2 of them were sending mostly gibberish, and it turned out that the muffled signal they were getting from those 2 antennas were bouncing off the surface of the moon because the antennas were pointing downward. Mission operators were able to modulate this signal to get a clean stream of data. So once again, innovative solutions for what could have been a disastrous scenario. As a result, Intuitive Machines expects to receive good data from 5 of the 6 NASA payloads on board. Only the stereo cameras for the Lunar Plume Surface Studies experiment, which was a very important experiment unfortunately, was going to capture the effects of the lander's engine plume as it interacted with the lunar surface, something very important because we need to start getting an idea of what's going to happen to the lunar regolith when more powerful engines come into contact with it, and this would have been a good start, but unfortunately, it's not responding, probably because it was damaged during the crash landing. By the way, Intuitive Machines isn't calling this a crash landing, but that is pretty much what happened here. Now, if this had been the only problem that the Intuitive Machines team had to deal with, that would have been bad enough, but this mission had problems apparently from minute one. From the time that the rocket, the Falcon 9 rocket that is, deployed the spacecraft, the star trackers on board failed. According to Steve Altemus, quote, "We had no way to navigate in space, so we were gently rolling and tumbling through space. The battery was not charging, we could not orient the spacecraft, we were losing communication. Hours after we got off the launch pad, we almost lost the spacecraft," which would have made it significantly worse than the Astrobotic mission. But the mission operators were eventually able to regain communications with the lander, and after diagnosing the problem, reset the star trackers. At the time that they reset those star trackers and got the navigation system up and running again, Odysseus was down to 3 hours of battery life left. And although we don't have all the details yet, apparently crises like this happened over and over again. According to Altemus, quote, "This mission kept throwing us alligators, and we would reduce these alligators to snapping turtles because they don't hurt as bad." So here's the deal. If one assumes that there's a 70% chance of recovering from any of these crises, but they had to address 11 of them apparently on the way to the moon, then the probability of mission success would be less than 2%. And yet, they did manage to land on the moon, which is nothing short of miraculous. According to Altemus, quote, "The reason we made it is right here, our people. The team we had, what they did, oh my god, they never quit. The perseverance, the resilience, just the power of the people we have in this team, that's why we're on the moon." Now, according to Eric Berger, just because the ship went through this crash landing and just because it fell over on its side and had a number of issues, well, a whole lot of issues actually, it's an ignorant take to call it a failure, to say that America is incapable of landing on the moon anymore. In his opinion, this was a success, given all of the adversities, all of the challenges that they had to overcome in order to get their probe to the surface of the moon and to keep most of the scientific payloads operational. To him, that is a notable success. I'm not sure if I would quite go that far, and here's why. Consider this quote. "Russian space officials have confirmed the loss of the Luna 25 spacecraft on the Telegram social media network. This is a stunning loss for the Russian space program, given that it is the country's first attempt to return to the moon since a 1976 robotic mission by the Soviet Union. The loss of Luna 25 represents a significant blow to the already reeling Russian space industry. Essentially, the modest moon mission was supposed to make Russia great in space again." Modest moon mission? How quickly are standards changed depending on the country who's sending the mission? And as I'm sure you can probably guess, this article was also written by Eric Berger. Luna 25 had a budget of about $130 million as opposed to the Intuitive Machines mission, which had a budget of about $118 million. So pretty similar missions when it comes right down to it, similar number of payloads. The vehicles even looked kind of similar to one another, although I have to say Luna 25 was a bit more squat and I think might have had a better chance of landing if it had actually functioned properly. Now, of course, we have to point out the obvious detail that Luna 25 crashed. It didn't succeed at all, and obviously Odysseus did far, far better. That being the case, though, this was the second CLPS mission that NASA had sent. The first mission from Astrobotic didn't even make it to lunar orbit. That being the case, then, I think we might have been a little tough on Roscosmos and Luna 25 given the recent experiences that we've had. Going to the moon is a difficult thing indeed. Even modest missions can run into unexpected problems that can lead to some pretty cataclysmic results, and Intuitive Machines is very fortunate indeed that they got as many positive results out of this mission as they did, given all of the problems that this probe experienced and the serious oversight that led to the failure of the laser altimeter in the first place. We need to keep in mind, before we start talking about successes, just how serious of a thing we're talking about here in the future. That is to say, landing human beings on the lunar surface. We cannot have successes like this when human beings are involved. We need to learn from these CLPS missions, learn what went wrong, get to the point to where landing on the moon becomes a lot more routine than it is right now, and only then can we say that we are ready to put the first human beings back on the moon in over 50 years. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, please subscribe. It's very important to the success of my channel, and also please
Is North Korea preparing for war? This is a question Western militaries are increasingly asking themselves after a massive resurgence in recent missile activity by the DPRK. It's not just military activity though. There are also some diplomatic movements unlike anything we've seen before. Since 2022, the Hermit Kingdom has launched a record number of nuclear-capable ballistic missile tests, including ones that would theoretically be able to reach the continental United States. This is now being classified as the #1 security threat by some American military brass. The rise of international conflict over the last 2 years created a gold mine of opportunity for North Korea, not just militarily, but economically and politically. And the country is looking at their potential options for finally changing the status quo. But is this just more of Kim Jong-un's saber-rattling, or is there a legitimate security threat on the horizon? But before we get into that, I think most people know what it's like to get into a car accident. And if you don't, I envy you. They're not fun. Whether it's a fender bender or, God forbid, an accident that lands you in the hospital, you need the majority of international trade that would otherwise go into and out of the area. These sanctions in turn greatly limit the DPRK's ability to manufacture or develop new weapon systems. Any strategy to generate income for the military has to be done through shady backdoor, under-the-table deals with the few nations that trade with North Korea like China, Russia, Iran, and Syria. And even then, it's still done reluctantly. Since the 1990s, a staple of North Korean leadership has been the building of its missile program, regularly conducting practice launches, creating whatever their fancy newest missile was, and even performing live nuclear tests as a show of power and capabilities. These threats were always a bit ambiguous in their legitimacy in terms of if the missile systems would have actually worked, and if so, was North Korea actually willing to commit them? Kim knows that any hot war with the South or any Western power would spell the potential end for his regime. But now, new opportunities are presenting themselves that might change that calculation. Between 2019 and 2022, the number of missile launches conducted by North Korea was actually falling at some of the lowest numbers in over a decade. 2019 saw only 10 launches, and 2020 only had 4. At the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023, however, those numbers skyrocketed to record levels. This was accompanied with the release of a dramatic video of Kim directing mobile missile launch vehicles, which even by North Korean standards was pretty cringe. 2022 alone saw over 70 missile launches, a new record. North Korea rocket and missile launches are typically timed in and around corresponding with major joint training exercises between South Korea and the United States, and are said to be done as quote-unquote defensive deterrence against imminent invasion preparations from the South. Despite recent doctrine changes in the North Korean military that permit the use of nuclear weapons offensively, intelligence analysts across the board agree that it would end North Korea as we know it. Kim knows this, and his goals with his growing number of nukes are twofold: assert dominance on the Korean peninsula and reemergence as a national power on the world stage. However, it can't do either of these things without a significant economic income. As unlikely as it might seem, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been one of the best